It's the highway to the licensing danger zone on NES Works episode 147.
Jenny got a gun.
We may be arriving at the advent of the 16-bit era with the launch of Sega's Genesis in America, but Sega wasn't ready to throw in the towel on 8-bit tech just yet. In addition to supporting the Master System for a couple more years in the US, they also teamed up with Nintendo's most enthusiastic nemesis of the NES era, Tengen. Tengen, of course, was Atari Games' angle on getting into the console biz in the NES era. Since Atari Inc. had split into twain following the console market crash in America, the arcade and consumer sides of the defunct corporation spun apart into different businesses. Atari Games did put a few of their titles on Atari 2600, but for the most part they kinda did their own thing. And their own thing at this point meant publishing for NES, since, after all, NES was where you could find the money in 1989. Compare Nintendo's business to the Atari Corp console lineup, which was simultaneously a confusing mess and also seen as an unwanted burden by the company behind it. Thanks, Jack Tramiel. Still, Atari Games had its own grudge against interloper Nintendo, whose console had taken the crown from the old Atari systems. So they went indie, bypassing Nintendo's manufacturing process and security measures to publish on NES without approval. In the process, they established a sort of coalition of Nintendo haters. In addition to Atari Games' own releases, Tengen also shipped quite a few games from Namco, which was both a natural business connection and also a bit of a take that to Nintendo. My understanding is that Namco had originally purchased Atari Inc.'s arcade division during the post-crash breakup, but they soon sold it back to a group of former Atari employees who established it as Atari Games. Despite this sell-off, Namco and Atari Games seemingly maintained a cordial, formal relationship, which is why you saw Pac-Man and RBI Baseball among Tengen's initial wave of Nintendo-licensed material. And in addition to rolling Namco into their rebellious katamari of game releases for NES, Tengen also landed several games from a rival console maker, Sega. While Namco's icy relationship with Nintendo had to do with behind-the-scenes corporate politics in Japan and was invisible to American kids in the 80s, Sega's adversarial relationship with Nintendo seems more intuitive. Although, really, the two companies weren't actually the knockdown, drag-out rivals in the 8-bit era that the subsequent console generation has led us to remember. Sega didn't really start pushing their aggressive anti-Nintendo rhetoric until the Super NES came along. Prior to that, the company's marketing line more or less amounted to, "We make video games and they're pretty neat." But the Master System was out there, so you can easily understand why Sega didn't publish directly on NES. Indirectly, however, they did, giving us NES games like Afterburner. Hang on a minute, you say. Afterburner on NES? That's crazy talk. Why, even the Master System could barely pull that off. Gentle viewer, you are not wrong. This is indeed crazy talk. And yet, nothing about Afterburner on NES is quite so crazy as the fact that it actually kind of works. God knows it ain't great, but it actually functions, and that in itself is kind of amazing. Of course, this version of Afterburner, which more properly is a home port of Afterburner 2, not that there's a huge difference between the two arcade machines, isn't a patch on the coin-op game. It also doesn't look anywhere near as good as the Master System version, and that version stands out in memory for being the point at which Sega's arcade-to-home pipeline began to break down for the Master System beyond repair. But versions of Afterburner showed up on all kinds of unlikely hardware, like the MSX. So, all things considered, this port sits firmly in the middle of the road. Functional, playable, yet also paltry and unimpressive. But in the end, hardly the worst thing ever to ship in an NES cartridge, unlicensed or otherwise. Afterburner on NES manages to convey the sweep and pitch of the horizon as your fighter rolls its way through the sky. You can, in fact, do a barrel roll, years before Slippy ever grasped the control yoke of an Arwing. Honestly, getting the horizon effect right pushes any version of Afterburner well on its way to the finish line, and the NES somehow manages to render about as smooth a horizon as the Master System did. So right there you have a bit of a tour de force for the platform, one that absolutely humbles Konami's Afterburner clone Top Gun. Now granted, the rest of this conversion falls well short of Sega's own home efforts. The F-14 Tomcat U-Pilot takes up only a fraction of the screen real estate as on Master System, to say nothing of how it compares to the visual proportions of the coin-op. Enemy fighters look equally minuscule, and the action moves at a slower pace in general. That works to your advantage in one sense. You have more time to spot incoming hazards on the radar display and prepare to evade or destroy them. And because your fighter occupies so little time on the screen, and the enemy fighters reflect that same sense of reduced scale, it means that when enemies stream in from your 6, you have more time to target and destroy them than in the screamingly fast coin-op game. Unfortunately, this is offset by the fact that the developers didn't think to adjust threats at 12 o'clock to account for the change in scale. In the arcade game, forward threats tended to appear directly in front of your plane, meaning that the player sprite tended to obscure the danger unless you actively pitched and yawed to vary your line of sight. That happens here on NES as well, but since everything is so tiny, you can barely see incoming planes or their missiles before you die without warning. By the time an approaching fighter shows up as a sprite any larger than a single pixel, they've already loosed a pair of homing missiles at you, giving you almost no time to evade. And need I tell you that Afterburner belongs very much to the Sega tradition of kicking your ass without remorse, despite it having entered the more genteel world of Nintendo here. 3 hits and you're out of lives, game over. Good luck making it past stage 2 or 3. Still, you do have to commend this version of Afterburner for simply existing. It's no small feat on this hardware. The credit for this accomplishment belongs not to Sega, or even Tengen, or Atari, but rather to Sunsoft. Sega Games had a slightly different relationship with Nintendo's console in Japan than here in the US, appearing at mainstream retailers courtesy of recognized partner publishers like Asmik and Sunsoft. The latter quite notably being one of the Big 8 companies that staked out an early claim on Famicom publishing and did a lot to help establish Nintendo's console as the big dog. Sunsoft had a strong relationship with Nintendo here in the US as well, but after their first couple of releases, the company changed up their approach and became wholly invested in publishing all new creations on NES rather than licensing in existing external works like Spy Hunter and Sky Kid. Maybe that's down to the quotas that Nintendo of America imposed on its partners, or maybe it's just that Sunsoft felt that original creations like Fester's Quest and Blaster Master would resonate more strongly than arcade ports with American audiences. Correctly, as it happens. Whatever the case, Sunsoft's Sega releases for Famicom ended up shipping from Tengen in the US, rather than from Sunsoft themselves. But without Sunsoft, this game never would have happened. According to a developer interview in Stefan Ganzer's book The History of Sunsoft Volume 1, Afterburner for Famicom came about as a passion project for Sunsoft's staff. One of those things that nagged at the nerds who live to do weird and impossible technical things. The question of, can we actually pull this off? The answer turned out to be yes, but only because of a technological advance. That advance was the Sunsoft 4 ROM chip. Like a lot of Famicom developers, Sunsoft created its own special memory mapper schemes to extend the hardware's capabilities beyond the base level. Konami's chips are the best known of these, but Namco had their own line as well, as did lesser-known companies like Sega. In America, Nintendo only allowed licensees to work with a handful of Nintendo-made chipsets, like the famous MMC-1 and MMC-3. But since the Famicom third-party process came about before Nintendo created a formal licensing and manufacturing system, the whole affair in Japan was a lot more anarchic, or at least more ad hoc, with publishers manufacturing their own carts and stuffing whatever tech they felt the market would bear into their games. The Sunsoft 4 chip offered several features to put it well beyond the capabilities of bare Famicom metal. Most of these corresponded to other memory management systems, but it did include one specific element that made Afterburner possible: high-speed bank switching. Without getting too bogged down in technical details, which aren't my forte anyway, bank switching allows consoles to swap the read-only data currently stored in active memory for data stored in a different section of the ROM. This allows a console to access much larger programs than the system memory alone could handle. In Afterburner, bank switching allows the background graphics to change quickly, allowing, for example, a remarkably smooth rotation effect for the horizon line by replacing the current background graphics set with one drawn at a different angle. In arcades, of course, the Afterburner board simply rendered everything as sprites that the hardware could move, rotate, and rescale individually or as groups. The horizon truly spun in the arcade game because it consisted of chunks of sprites glued together and transformed to within an inch of their lives. The NES and its tile-based graphical chip couldn't do anything like that, so instead it simply treats the horizon and the rest of the background as more or less a static element. When you change the angle of your plane's orientation in Afterburner, the game simply loads in a different static element. Think of the background here like a matte painting of the horizon. In practice, both your fighter and the background actually sit totally still, with the so-called matte painting looping simple animations to create the sensation of forward motion. When you change the pitch of your plane, the plane remains motionless, and the game instantly swaps in a different painting that presents the horizon at a different angle. The longer you rotate, the more background images the game swaps in to sell the illusion of rotation. It's a pretty solid fake-out effect, and the whole thing is really only let down by the puny sprites plastered over the top of the dizzying backgrounds. And as Sunsoft's programmer stated in Ganser's book, the illusion rests on the speed at which the Sunsoft 4 chip can load in those alternate backdrops. Pretty damn fast as it happens. Now, if Afterburner had shipped in the US under license, Nintendo would have forced it to run on one of their official mappers, which may not have worked given the unique properties of the Sunsoft 4 chip. It's entirely possible that Sunsoft would have attempted to bring this game to NES themselves if they could have. But, and again I speculate, no memory management chips available in 1989 could handle this sort of advanced bank switching. I believe that the MMC5 chip could have managed it, but that wouldn't make its debut in the US until Castlevania 3 shipped nearly a year after this Afterburner cart popped up from Tengen. Or who knows, maybe I'm wrong about all of this. Maybe there's nothing fancy about Afterburner at all, and Sunsoft just didn't think Americans like cool games about airplanes after Sky Kid's chilly reception here. Anyway, Tengen, unfettered by Nintendo's rules and regulations, produced their version of Afterburner on the same ROM setup that the Famicom cartridge utilized, making this the only US release to be powered by the Sunsoft 4 chip. But interestingly, they didn't just grab the game from Sunsoft and publish it as is in America. Someone, and neither Ganser's book nor the researchers at GDRI have been able to pin down the identity of the responsible parties, did some programming work on the US release. Sunsoft actually shipped this game as Afterburner 2 on Famicom, but here in the US, Tengen released it under the first game's name. They stripped out the Famicom's cool title screen animation, as well as the 2, and amusingly changed the Sun Enterprise's name on the aircraft carrier deck to read Tengen Enterprise, which itself was a hack of Sega Enterprise from the original game. There are some differences. The levels progress in a slightly different order. Incoming missiles give you more time to evade in the Japanese version, and the Famicom cart sounds a lot better. It includes voice samples and some solid sampled percussion, which improves the music considerably. Also, the music in the Japanese release is recognizable as the Afterburner soundtrack. The Tengen release, not so much. Otherwise, though, it plays almost identically to the Famicom release. The Master System version from a year and a half earlier was still more impressive, of course, but this is a pretty respectable start for Sega's brief run on NES via Tengen, illegal or otherwise. Next time on NES Works, Sega and Tengen's criminal rampage continues unabated.